Is Europe finally gearing up to become a military powerhouse? That's the stated ambition of the European Commission and its president Ursula von der Leyen. In March 2025, they unveiled the Rearm Europe plan, a massive initiative promising 800 billion euros in additional defense spending over the coming years, and a historic loosening of the EU fiscal rules to allow deficit spending for defense, with the goal of countering the growing threat of Russia. But is this plan really the game changer it's made out to be? In this video, we will break down why Europe's rearmament is far less likely to succeed than it seems. In particular, we will give 5 critical reasons why this ambitious plan might fall short, leaving Europe struggling to reclaim its place as a global power. Reason 1. There is simply no money to rearm. The Rearm Europe plan sounds impressive on paper, with 800 billion euros in additional defense spending by 2030 to transform Europe's military capabilities. But here is the catch. Only 150 billion of that comes directly from the EU. The rest, it's up to the member states to foot the bill. The problem is that many of these countries are in no shape to ramp up spending. France and Italy are drowning in debt. Germany's economy is stuck in a recession with its industrial base losing steam, and even the UK, though outside the EU, faces its own economic woes. A clear sign of the troubles ahead are the rising 30 years bond yields, which signal an ever-growing fiscal burden. In France, for example, debt interest payments are projected to soon become the first budget item. Some argue that boosting defense spending could spark industrial growth and lift GDP. But with Europe's sky-high energy and labor costs, that's a risky bet. The reality is that a dramatic increase in defense spending is looking more like a pipe dream than a plan at the moment. Reason 2. European nations struggle to work together. One would think the European countries know how to collaborate efficiently and to run successful projects together, as is the case with Airbus, the leading civilian aerospace manufacturer. But when it comes to military projects, success stories are the exception, not the rule. Take, for example, the Future Combat Air System, a flagship initiative uniting France, Germany and Spain to develop a cutting-edge 6th-generation fighter jet ecosystem by the 2040s, which is already mired in conflict. France, led by Dassault, insists on taking the lead, citing its unmatched expertise in building fighter jets like the Rafale. Germany, however, holds the purse strings and wants a bigger say. In particular, there is the thorny issue of intellectual property. Who gets to own the technology that's developed? These clashing priorities, rooted in national pride and sovereignty, have delayed the FCAS, with Dassault even threatening to walk away. This isn't just a hiccup. It's a glaring sign that when sovereignty is on the line, Europe's unity crumbles, jeopardizing the continent's ambitious rearmament goals. Reason 3. Europe's political instability makes long-term plans precarious. It's no secret that many European governments are on shaky ground. Traditional parties are losing ground to far-right disruptors, and public discontent is boiling over. Political instability is spiking. In France, governments are collapsing under the weight of the fiscal crisis, while the UK has churned through a record number of prime ministers in recent years. This constant political turnover makes it difficult to push through long-term projects like the Rearm Europe plan, which demands steady leadership and consensus. Worse still, the rising far-right in many countries doesn't always see Russia as the enemy. Hence, instead of backing aggressive rearmament, some of these parties could advocate for accommodation with Moscow, undermining the urgency of the EU's defense push. Reason 4. Europe's armed forces can't attract enough soldiers. Rearmament isn't just about money and weapons. People are needed to do the actual fighting. But here is the problem. Most European militaries are struggling to meet recruitment targets. Take the UK, where the Royal Navy is in such a dire shortage of sailors that it's had to mothball warships. Other countries, like Germany and France, are facing similar woes, with empty barracks and shrinking ranks. So why is this happening? The truth is that financial incentives alone aren't cutting it. Traditionally, militaries relied on patriotic young men driven by a sense of duty, but in today's Europe, patriotism is often viewed skeptically, and traditional masculine values are increasingly sidelined. This disconnect leaves the demographic most likely to enlist feeling alienated from the armed forces. Meanwhile, newcomers and migrants, who might bolster recruitment numbers, often lack a strong sense of connection to their adoptive countries, making them less likely to sign up. Thus, it is no surprise that the number of people in Western Europe ready to fight for their country is at an all-time low, and without enough boots on the ground, Europe's rearmament plans are essentially doomed. Reason 5. Europe's defense industry is losing its edge. This might be the most controversial point of the video, as Europe's defense industry is still a global powerhouse, renowned for the quality of its weapons and highly competitive on the export market. Take France for example, which is now the world's second largest arms exporter, ahead of Russia. However, on closer inspection, the picture might not be so rosy. First, arms exports are not just about quality, they are political by nature. Hence, buyers often choose weapons to signal alliances, not just performance. Europe's recent export wins, like France's Rafale jets replacing Russian Su-35s in countries like Indonesia and Egypt, might owe more to sanctions on Russia than to the superiority of the Rafale. But now the situation is quickly changing, with new players like South Korea, Turkey and China that are gaining ground with cheaper, competitive alternatives. As for Russia, one might expect that with the coming end of the war in Ukraine, sanctions might be lifted, and its weapons, now battle-proven, might once again flood the global market. The crux of the problem for Europe is that its weapons are simply not cost-effective. The Russo-Ukrainian war showed that affordable, practical equipment often trumps expensive high-tech gear. Yet European weapons, often over-engineered, come with sky-high price tags for only marginal gains in performance. However, the worst might be yet to come, as Europe is seemingly slowly falling behind in a number of cutting-edge technologies like drones, 5th and 6th generation fighters, hypersonic missiles, and AI, where the US, China and Russia are pulling ahead. Of course, Europe does not necessarily need to produce all of its weapons and can import the latest and greatest gear from the US, but American weapons are not exactly cheap either, and relying excessively on imports would undermine the Rearm Europe plan's vision of a self-sufficient, militarily strong continent. Europe needs then to seriously invest in innovative technologies, but as we have seen, money is scarce and cooperation can be difficult, meaning that in 10 or 15 years a number of European products might simply be obsolete. Thus, Europe's much-touted rearmament is quite frankly unlikely at this stage, and the Rearm Europe plan might end up being a case of too little too late, as the need is just too great, especially now that Europe has gifted a lot of its weapons to Ukraine. In fact, the real struggle for the European nations will be to hold on to what little capabilities they have left, but substantially adding to them is unrealistic given the financial and political constraints most of them face today.